Hello. Today I'm going to talk to you about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, chapters 5 and 6. Both pretty short chapters. In chapter 5, Frederick talks about how when he lived on Colonel Lloyd's plantation as a child, he says that he was too young to work in the fields, so he had to do jobs like driving the cows, keeping the birds and fowls out of the garden, cleaning the yard, running errands for his daughter, for Colonel Lloyd's daughter. And once again, he was too young to work in the fields. He said he didn't get whipped that much on Colonel Lloyd's plantation. He was seldom whipped. He says he often suffered from hunger. The kids were often fed something called, that we commonly would know, like cornmeal mush. And they often would put like a big bowl of cornmeal mush in between all the children. And all the children would be eating out of the same pot or whatever they had the stuff in. He says the bigger, stronger, and faster you were, the more you ate. The littler kids got pushed away. So they kind of like had to fight over this. He says they suffer from cold a lot. He says it was so cold he felt like he was going to die sometimes. He says sometimes he would sleep in a sack. He used to take a sack that they used to keep like potatoes or corn in and sleep in it. Talks about he was like 7 years old when he finally left Colonel Lloyd's plantation and he was sent to Baltimore. He says when he left Colonel Lloyd's plantation, he felt no sadness at all. He went to live with some people called Mr. and Mrs. Auld, and he says that when he arrived at their house in Baltimore, he says that, and he took a boat from where he was to Baltimore. Okay, he says that when he came to their house, this was the first time that he saw white people standing at the door smiling at him. So this was kind of like a pleasant surprise. And he says when he left Colonel Lloyd's plantation, he felt no connection to it. He didn't feel sorry, feel sad, like many slaves feel when they leave like their families or the plantation. Okay, chapter 6. Okay, Frederick is now living with the Aulds. He says that Mrs. Auld was a very kind mistress. A mistress comes from me, what I understand, seems like to be the wife of the slave owner. Says that she was very kind, had a good heart. She had never in her life had owned slaves before. He says that even the meanest of slaves felt very good in her presence. She didn't require that slaves look down when they speak to her. They were allowed to look at her in the eyes and things like that. One of the things that Mrs. Auld started doing was she started teaching Frederick to read and spell. She started to teach him his ABCs. She started to teach him 3 and 4 letter words. And she started to teach him just how to read books. She felt like slaves should be educated. So one day, her husband, Mr. Auld, comes home and sees this and puts an end to this. He kind of goes into deep with her, like a deep scolding, kind of like some of the things that he tells her that first of all, it's illegal to teach blacks, and also that it's just a bad thing to do. He says that learning, he told her, one of the couple of things that he told her was that learning would spoil the best black. He used the N-word. He says that learning would spoil them. And he says that teaching a slave would make them unmanageable. You wouldn't be able to control them anymore. And just something you should never do is teach slaves. It just would not be a good thing. Frederick saw this whole thing play out. He heard everything he said. And this was like this was a revelation to Frederick. This is when he kind of started to understand, now I understand what's being hidden from me. Okay, I understand that one of the powers that these slave owners have over black people was that they have education. And they don't want us to have education. They don't want us to know our situation. They don't want us to know anything other than what we're told. So this moment gave Frederick a purpose and a drive to seek education and his freedom from that point on. He says he noticed in the chapter, he noticed that there was a difference between a city slave and slaves that lived on like a plantation or farm. He says that city slaves almost went about like they were free, whereas a farm slave, you could tell they were slaves. They were like in a devastated mode all the time. He even says the slave owner, the city slave owner versus the plantation slave owners had a different mentality. Slave owners that owned slaves in the city never wanted their slaves to ever say anything like that they weren't being fed properly, they weren't being clothed properly. So they may have took care of their slaves a little bit better than people were on the farm. So this was chapters 5 and 6 of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Hope you enjoyed. We'll be back with chapter 7 sometime. Peace.